So today I'm going to talk about something completely different than what I normally talk about on this channel and actually talk about something other than Guild Wars 2. I'm not normally much of a shooter player, although I've done my time in Battlefield and Overwatch the same as everyone else has done at some point or another. But World War III caught my eye for a couple reasons. The first is it's an indie game made by the studio Farm 51, which was kind of personal interest to me since I'm currently working to create my own indie studio. And second, because it does something rather novel in that it's using a shooting system that aims to be very realistic, at least in terms of ballistics, but it's also, the game is designed to be very approachable and has a more arcadey node capture game mode. And which is a design idea I thought pretty interesting, as most shooters prior to this generally fall on the lines of either being extremely arcadey, in the way that Call of Duty or Battlefield are, or just being super hardcore realism in the way that, like, Squad is. So having a game that tries to mix those two is rather interesting in and of itself. The game is available, has early access on Steam, and early access is basically just a polite term for premature release. The game is missing a lot of content that it's supposed to have. Many of the weapon customization items in terms of attachment don't actually do anything, and the weight system is not fully implemented, and so forth. Game has a lot of bugs as well, just in terms of animation bugs and netcode glitchiness. Unfortunately, this kind of a launch is kind of typical for smaller studios that don't have the funding of larger studios that are backed by major publishers. For smaller indie studios, it's often a release now or go bankrupt, regardless of whether the game is ready or not. Regardless of how unfinished the game is, I still found it quite enjoyable to play, even though I'm rather terrible at it and never do particularly well. I particularly liked the fact that the game actually allowed for an extensive degree of customization, both on the character and the guns. For example, on the guns you can customize attachments, be it forward grips, bipods, laser pointers, scopes, secondary scopes for different ranges and so forth, magazine capacity. And these all actually affected the performance of the weapon, although some of the features aren't fully implemented yet. So this actually allowed for a degree of build crafting, which is something you normally don't see in shooters. Most shooters are pretty strict on the degree of customization with regards to performance. The limit on build crafting with the guns, though, is weight. Like, the more stuff you put on a gun, the heavier it is, and the heavier your character is, the slower they run. Weight is split into tiers, though. There's like light, medium, and heavy. Heavy characters run the slowest. But it's with the weight, since it is tiers, as long as you can stay in a certain tier, you keep that speed bonus for that tier. So, for example, I figured out that you could have a fully loaded assault rifle and some pretty heavy armor on your character and still make medium weight as long as you only carried a pistol as your secondary, which is what I ended up doing most of the time, since I preferred having a bit more speed than heavier kits allowed, but I also liked having the armor since I'm rather bad at the game. I kind of need that extra armor. You can also customize the character to a large degree, so if you like Fashion Wars, you can do that in this game. The changes to your character's appearance don't actually affect performance, although if you select a headgear that is not a helmet, you do not get the head armor that you would normally have, so there is a disadvantage to wearing hats. But outside of that, the appearance customizations don't actually affect performance. Excluding the number of features that have not been fully implemented yet, there's only a few things with the game that have really bothered me so far. First is that the user interface doesn't like my 4K screen too much. Text is very difficult to read. Some of the buttons are hard to click on because they're so small, and some of the heads-up display is like partially off screen. Additionally, the netcode for the game is pretty buggy. Characters, particularly when they're running, can appear to teleport a bit and bug around a bit. This is particularly noticeable on vehicles. Sometimes it's pretty bad, sometimes it's not too bad. In a shooter, this is particularly problematic because it makes aiming hard. And sometimes when you get shot at, it'll take a second for it to actually register on your client. So you'll die. It'll seem like you got killed instantly, and then you look at the death log and you've been shot like 12 times before you died. And you just didn't know because the server hadn't updated the client. And while this is pretty bad for gameplay, I can't really blame the developers too much. The game is done on the Unreal Engine 4, which is a very powerful engine, and it does have good networking in it. Paragon and Fortnite prove that. But one of the big issues with it, with regards to networking, is that for developers, there's very little documentation for the networking and multiplayer connectivity related aspects of the engine. I've actually worked with it on a few projects before, and like they provide nothing but the most basic documentation for those sections. And like the other feature sets of the engine aren't related to network and multiplayer are very well documented. They have all sorts of tutorials for developers on how to optimize and best practices and all that. But for networking, they just give you, you know, the basic, there are these functions, they take these parameters and output this kind of documentation. They don't give you any advice. They don't even tell you like how costly given networking related things are versus other possible implementations for networking. It's very bare bones and basic, which means that developers often have to basically guess and check with regards to optimization. You know, basically test it. Okay, did it run better? Did it run worse? And this is a really horrible way to go around trying to optimize your engine, because it means you can't really tell if you're doing it right until after you've done it. And of course, for an indie studio that's low on manpower and they can't be wasting man hours like that, this is a huge problem. I actually got the chance to speak with a couple of the engineers for the Unreal Engine at a convention, and they told me that the reason there's so little documentation for networking is because in Epic Games, which is the company that makes the Unreal Engine, they have like engineers that are basically dedicated to doing the documentation for each aspect of the engine, but they just don't have anyone dedicated to doing documentation for networking because I guess no one wanted to do it, which is kind of leaves a lot of developers that are trying to work with the Unreal Engine just in a really bad spot. So hopefully Epic can get some proper documentation so that we don't have all these Unreal Engine based games coming out with really poor networking. Like, the networking issue is not something specific to World War III at all. Moving away from bugs and netcode, just to talk purely about how the game's designed and ignoring any bugs and unfinished implementations, I actually like this shooter more than any other shooter I've played. I already mentioned the customization. The gunplay felt really solid, at least when the netcode wasn't bugging out. I liked that it's a lot less gadget-based. I mean, there are lots of gadgets and tanks and things in this game, but it's not like Battlefield where like half your deaths are from some like rocket or remote-controlled thing or some like landmine doodad or whatever. You know, most of your deaths are from getting shot, not from gimmicks. Although there is one gimmick in this game, which is people using RPGs as melee weapons, which the developers already said they were going to try and do something about, so hopefully that'll change. But the one problem that I have found in the game is the way the maps are designed. And I'm not talking visually. In fact, visually the maps are amazing, and they actually are all based on like the real world locations. Like, the buildings you see, you would actually see there in real life, which is kind of the problem. In terms of map flow, you know, all the maps are urban environments. They're really built up, and you have lots of various hallways and corridors and so forth. And because the maps are these rabbit warrens of corridors and passages, it means there's not really a front line in the game. There's no direction the enemy attacks from. You'll have enemies in front of you, to the left of you, to the right of you, behind you. You'll have allies in front of you, to the left of you, behind you, whatever. And this means that it's basically impossible to actually like control the angles you're getting attacked from. You will die constantly in this game from getting shot in the back, and it's something that you just can't avoid. And because of this, because of the inability to have like a front line, a direction that you know the enemy is going to come from, it means that a lot of the game is devolved into basically everyone clumping up and rushing in a group. Because if you spread out a bit, what happens is inevitably enemies get behind you through the dozens and dozens of flanking passages that are impossible to keep controlled. So invariably any smaller group of players just gets flanked and killed very quickly, which means you need to get into these large groups, these death balls of players, so that the entire group of players has enough eyes to protect themselves, which, I mean, you may say that's a strategy thing, but it also kind of limits, you know, the play styles that can be used. Like, you never see people defending capture points, because it's impossible to defend a capture point, because if you sit there trying to wait for an enemy to happen, well, you can only watch at a given time like maybe 3 of like the 6 ways an enemy could enter a capture point, which means you inevitably get shot in the back trying to defend. There's just no position you could possibly take defensively that would be viable because of the sheer number of directions any given objective can be attacked from. Now, some maps are worse about this than others. The Berlin map that I played the most on, it's not too bad. There are a couple places where you have basically parallel hallways, which is just really annoying because it means you can have like an enemy running down one hallway while your allies go up the next, and then the enemy turns around and shoots you on the back, and you can't really do anything about that. But outside of those few hallways, Berlin's not too bad, but some of the other maps, I think the snowy map, which I think is Moscow, or possibly it was the Polish map, I don't know, but in that map, there's this courtyard, which is surrounded completely by buildings, and players can access all of the second floor windows all the way around this courtyard. And then in the courtyard, there's a capture objective. And there's also multiple tunnels that lead into the courtyard. So anyone trying to capture that courtyard, they can get attacked by literally every second story window going around the courtyard, and they can also be attacked by people coming out of the multiple ground entrances into the courtyard. And it's like, that's impossible to cover. Like, you can't defend that. You could get into the second floor windows and try and defend from there, but even then, since these are 360 windows all the way around, all the second floor windows can shoot all the other second floor windows while also being able to be shot at from the ground. So even like defending from a window can get quite risky because of the sheer number of directions you can get shot from. And it's just very frustrating because, again, you just get shot from people that are shooting at you off camera constantly. And they do have like a footstep auditory system so that you can hear players coming towards you. But a lot of times this isn't too useful either because the enemy just shoots you from so far away that you've never heard the footsteps, or because you have allies nearby, because ally footsteps sound the same as enemy footsteps. And this is also compounded by the fact that voices are the same for players on both teams, because players actually get to pick their own voice for their character, be it French, German, Polish, whatever, Russian. So the voices are the same for both teams, the footsteps are the same for both teams. There's just nothing you can really use to determine whether that noise you hear is an ally or an enemy, which is annoying because, like, I've died sometimes because I hear someone behind me, I turn around expecting it to get flanked, and it was really an ally, and before I can turn back around, I get shot from someone coming, like, the other way that was coming from the direction that I was originally looking. Like, the game's just, it doesn't give you the tools for which to defend yourself from getting flanked constantly. And I mean, in shooters you get flanked, it happens. But in this game, you just die from getting flanked perpetually. Like, most of your deaths in this game are from getting flanked. And it's just a bit too much. I would like a bit more stability, a bit more of a front line, a direction that I know the enemies are going to be coming from, so I don't have to watch literally every direction around me. That would make the game a lot less frustrating and would make me a lot less paranoid. But that's really the only design issue I've found in this game. Now, it's a pretty big design issue, and they really do need to fix it. They do need to make it possible to defend objectives. But it is what it is. Outside of that, I think it's a great game. I've really enjoyed playing it, and while I'm not normally a shooter player, whenever I get that urge to, go shoot up some random people on the internet, this is probably the game I'll be playing.